Okay, so thanks a lot. First of all, I have to say what I'm presenting is based on joint research. There are two other colleagues involved, Christian Adam, also from University of Munich, and Xavier Fernandez from Pompeu Fabra University in Barcelona. The paper is based on data collected within a large-scale FP7 project, which also Adrienne was involved as a project partner, and we still, we've collected many data, and the project is officially finished 2 years ago, but we still, have not fully exploited the potential of these data, and so this paper is part of this attempt to work with these data. So what the starting point is for us is a normative debate on the size of government. And you find in the political debates, you find a lot of controversial statements, whether the government is too small or too big, whether the states should spend more or less. It's particularly pronounced in the US, but you also find it in the European context. I just put here some quotes on the slide to illustrate this. Now, from a social science perspective, the big question is what determines the size of the state, the size of government, and there is a very old hypothesis formulated by an Austrian economist, Wagner, more or less 150 years ago, arguing that there is an expectation of ever-expanding scope and increasing importance of governmental activity as a response to functionalist requirements, technological innovation, population growth. And this, of course, this hypothesis has been formulated in the context of industrialization, but still there are many arguments you find today that it still holds also in the modern context today. And there have been a range of efforts to test this hypothesis. It's still very an important issue in the public finance literature to what extent this expectation can be confirmed. So there's focus on governmental budgets. There's also focus on governmental organization. To what extent do we see an ever expansion of governmental organizations, or do we see kind of dismantling or termination of such organizations? It also has been investigated with regard to government employment, and more recently also with regard to government's policy agendas. It never has been analyzed with regard to what we would call policy portfolios or the regulatory output of governments. And that is exactly what we want to do in this paper. So we first of all are confronted with the question, how can we measure regulatory outputs, policy portfolios, the size and growth of this development? And secondly, of course, which factors account for different growth rates of policy portfolios? So first of all, the measurement question. I give you two examples. What we mean or how you can identify changes in policy portfolios. Basically, we distinguish between two categories. On the one hand, governments can add new policy items to their portfolios, such as in the first examples, parental benefits, or in the second example, address a new issue like sulfur dioxide emissions from industrial plants. This is one thing. And the other thing, by addressing these items, they can use one or more different policy instruments, like standards or information rights or taxes or whatsoever. So you have two basic ways how governmental portfolios can change over time. Now, what we do in this paper is to adopt a spatial approach. So we go. We analyze the number, or we assume that you have different policy items that can be combined with a range of different policy instruments. And what we do is it's a very empirical approach. We look at a sample of countries, 23 OECD countries. We look at two policy areas, social and environmental policy, over a period of 30 years, and just look at what we find empirically. How many policy items have been addressed within the whole sample of countries, and how many policy instruments can we potentially identify. And this is kind of our baseline. We look at this in the year 2005 as a baseline, as a kind of maximum policy space that could be occupied by a country. So just to give you an example, this is social policy in Italy. So on the horizontal line, you see the different policy items that could be addressed, and the vertical axis, you see the different policy instrument categories we found. And the dark spaces mean that these are the spaces occupied, yeah, or the area occupied within this space. And you see that within 30 years, Italy, over time, the number of policy items that have been addressed increased, but also the number of policy instruments. Within single items, new instruments were added to the policy portfolio. Another example here is United States environmental policy. Same picture, you see that you have certain changes, increase in policy space filled over time. So now let's have more detailed look at the data. I already said it's based on a joint project. We look at a period of 30 years, and we analyze legislation over of this period for 43 OECD countries. More or less, data collection was based on input from national experts. They were more or less delivered as legislation, the relevant legislation. Coding was all done within the project to ensure consistency, and we looked at three subfields for each policy area. Environmental policy, we looked at air quality, water protection, and nature conservation. Social policy focused on unemployment benefits, child benefits, and pensions. So now what we get is, first of all, that you see here overall there is the proportion of space occupied within our two-dimensional space increased over time. So portfolios, policy portfolios in both policy areas were growing over time. The growth is more pronounced in environmental policy. This is simply because of the fact that this is a much younger policy field, so you have probably more saturation effects in social policy. But you see overall, they're more or less, in terms of average space occupied by the year 2005, they're more or less very similar in terms of policy portfolios. If you look at the countries, you see strong variation across countries, different growth rates, partially very different developments across the two policy areas. You see also, I don't want, for time reason, will not go so much into detail here. We have another graph there. You see, again, you see more clearly the differences across the countries. So very, in environmental policy, very pronounced developments in France, Austria, and Italy. Social policy, again, Italy and Spain with relatively strong growth rates, whereas Finland, Denmark show very low growth rates in social policy, and Norway, Japan, New Zealand, very low rates with regard to environmental policy. Now, the big question is, of course, how can we explain this? And we used here, let's say, very conventional theoretical arguments you find in the literature, and yeah, there's nothing particularly exciting with regard to the theories we used. We just based our analysis on this state-of-the-art, theoretical state-of-the-art, what you find. And in fact, I'm not so sure at the moment how we should interpret the findings we get, because if it's kind of a disappointing finding or if it's more kind of exciting finding we could work with, because more or less we don't really see much in terms of significant effects of these different variables. And this is insofar very interesting because our hunch is at the moment, as soon as you look at policy developments over longer periods of time, so we look at 30 years developments, trends over 30 years, all of these classical theoretical variables that are used do not show to have a strong effect. So this is from our perspective, I think a very interesting finding, and to some extent challenges the, let's say, standard explanation in this public policy literature. So just to give you some more details, the first argument, of course, is a functionalist one. You could say, well, countries with higher GDP or higher GDP growth rates should deliver or display stronger portfolio growths. On the second argument you find is you know, trade openness that can have either a stimulating effect, a kind of race to the top effect, or a race to the bottom effect. But in any way, functionalist, in any case, trade openness should matter to some extent. What we find, however, none of these factors has turned out to have any significant explanatory effect. The second argument we use or look at is the party matter hypothesis, and we look at for environmental policy, the participation of green parties in government. For social policy, we look at the representation of socialist parties in government, and again, you could argue the more you have green parties in government, the more should environmental policy portfolios grow, and the similar argument you should find for socialist parties. In fact, what we get here is kind of, it depends a bit how we conceptualize institutional factors, institutional constraints, whether we use veto players or whether we use Hainish political constraints index. But basically, for the Green Party effect, we do not see a statistically significant effect, and Socialist Party is interesting with regard to the veto players argument. I can have here some graphs where you can see that if you look at the lower graph on veto player, you see that there's an interesting relationship that the more socialist parties are represented in government, the lower is the portfolio growth on social policy. So this is contrary to political rhetorics, but it's well in line with research on welfare state change. People like Sylvia Heusermann and others have pointed to this effect, that sometimes it's easier for left parties to cut back social spending, or to reduce more or less the welfare state, and the left parties not always the ones who are the most dominant expanders of welfare state and social policy. But you see, it's really very much dependent on how you conceptualize institutional variables. Then, if you look at institutional constraints, again, we find very inconsistent, very unclear results. We look at two variables. On the one hand, the classical variable institutional hurdles, veto points, and on the other hand, we look at government effectiveness. That means the capacity for implementation. So we would expect the more you have capacities for implementing policies, the easier it should be for growing your policy portfolios, because implementing capacity is a basic requirement that you can add new policies to your portfolio. Now, again, what we see here is, first of all, that with regard to the first variable, we only see an effect of the veto player argument here. We find also a very counterintuitive finding. The more veto players you have, the more portfolio growth you have, both with regard to environmental policy and social policy. Effect disappears if we conceptualize institutional constraints based on Hainish index. So it's not really a very clear-cut finding. If we look at government effectiveness, here you get also very interesting results, but only in this case, only if we rely on the Polcon index. Here you find the effect that the lower institutional capacities for implementation are, the higher are the growth rates for policy portfolios. This means, this could imply that a lot of this growth we observe is more or less symbolic, because there is a lack of implementation capacities to actually execute these policies that have been added to the policy portfolio. But again, this is not really, it depends a bit how you conceptualize the institutionalist variable. So we're not really that clear on this side. Finally, we looked at country policy legacy. So we asked, well, you could argue, well, there are some countries who have a reputation as environmental leaders, environmental pioneers, and you could expect that these legacies play a role in terms of portfolio growth. And we also looked at welfare state tradition, basically assuming or expecting that countries with a liberal welfare state tradition should grow less strongly than other countries with another welfare state tradition. These arguments, again, if you look into our results, it's not that clear. That, you do not have a very strong effect and let's say a statistically reliable effect when we regardless of the kind of conceptualization of our institutionalist variable. So overall, I mean, we get some findings that were some interesting arguments, but in general, we are still struggling a bit of how we could explain this general picture. We observe a clear tendency of portfolio growth, very substantial variation across countries, but we face a problem that these conventional state-of-the-art explanations do not really work, and especially I think that is the crucial point we get, or the crucial message we can develop out of this paper, that as soon as you consider long-term trends, these classical explanations face some serious challenges. Maybe a final word on EU effects. One could argue that we should observe converging growth developments in EU member states, especially in environmental policy, where the EU more and more plays a central role for regulatory change. We do not see, actually, we do not find these converging effects if you look at the member states in our sample. Basically, we would argue the EU is more a barrier to portfolio reduction, to dismantling, rather than an essential driver of policy growth. And this is also supported by recent research we did. So you might have noted we left out a very interesting period, the crisis years from 2007, 2008 onwards, simply because of the fact that the project started before these crisis times. And we are currently trying to enlarge our data set to collect these data for these crisis years, and also include data on the EU, development of policy portfolios in the EU. And what we see is a first impression that the EU simply stops. It's not in a way that the EU cuts back or dismantles policies, but if you look at environmental policy, we just see that during the crisis years, the EU more or less stopped to develop new environmental policies. So this is just a very, let's say, so far anecdotal evidence, but basically we do not see a very strong EU effect in all our analysis so far. So that's it. Thanks a lot.